Thanks very
Hello.
much.
Yes.
I think in light of the fact that our last two presentations, and indeed the last day and a half, have been full of very useful information, I want to level set expectations on the next 20 minutes. As of a week ago, I was giving a 5-minute introduction of what promises to be, I think, 4 very excellent presentations coming up. Because many things in the last week have changed, I'm no longer just introducing for 5 minutes, but I'm certainly not going to be presenting you a deck for the next 20. So what I will be doing is providing something of an extended introduction with a little bit of retrospective on where we've come from through the M competitions and what indeed the value and applicability is. So that being said, if anyone was hoping for 20 minutes of dense content that you wanted to take notes from, now might be the time for a bio break while we wait for the first of the real applicability presentations to come up. It is my privilege to be among so many distinguished researchers and practitioners of business forecasting. And over the last day and a half, we've seen excellent discussions on very important topics like judgment, which I would argue, particularly in times like we've found ourselves for the last 18 months, is of critical importance in understanding practical business forecasting. On uncertainty, which as every practitioner knows, and as Kahneman, Tversky, and then later Richard Thaler proved, makes judgment so difficult. And the UFO challenge, which will, I hope, allow us to understand how better to expand the reach and adoption of business forecasting, despite the fact that we have decades of experience proving its value. But the next 4 presentations are, to me anyway, ultimately what the M's have been about for 40 years. To begin with, my name is Jonathon. I'm one of the founding partners of Northfind Management and currently its CEO. And we're a consulting practice whose core focus is and has always been practical application of both best practices and state-of-the-art to demand planning, supply planning, and operational challenges. And I think the value and applicability of the M5 competition has been practical application from their inception. Before I introduce the next 4 topics, and because, like I said, I've got an extra 15 minutes, and the next 4 topics explores the many facets of the M5's applicability to practical business forecasting, I'd like to go back to before the beginning. And don't worry, I'm not going to go too far back. I want to make sure we leave as much time as possible for our speakers. So I'll be quick. But I've just finished writing a book on the history of business forecasting, and I hope you'll indulge me a few moments of retrospection while it's still fresh in my mind. The antecedents of business forecasting are certainly centuries old and arguably millennia old, but the first concrete examples of business forecasting only arise in the 1920s, and they're highlighted by a very public spat between the best known trend forecaster of the time, Roger Babson, and his counterpart, who was Yale's first economist and PhD in economics, and a proponent of causal forecasting, and that was Irving Fisher. And over the next couple of decades, we don't really see much substantive development in business forecasting until Robert Goodell Brown adopted a technique he had originally developed in the 1940s for calculating depth charge trajectories on continuous variables, for sinking German U-boats, and then applied it to inventory management in the 1950s, adapting it for discrete variables, and thus simple exponential smoothing and a whole class of forecasting tools was born. As most of you know, Holt and Winters followed shortly thereafter, although I would argue they just did a better job of popularizing the triple smoothing method that Brown had already articulated. And by the late 1960s, we begin to see these time series methods reasonably widespread and reasonably well established. An important turning point takes place in 1970, however, and that was because computing capacity and access to it had developed to the place where research could begin looking at the practical application of much bigger ideas. And it carried forward the precepts of time series forecasting to a significantly more sophisticated and complicated place. And that's when George Box and Willem Jenkins published their Box-Jenkins or ARIMA method. And this really is where we find ourselves at the first crossroads of technical sophistication or state of the art and practical application. Especially back then, using run sequence plots and autocorrelation plots to determine stationarity and periodicity, Box-Jenkins is definitely a less heuristic approach than exponential smoothing. But it also took significantly more work, and it requires significantly more preparation and data, and poses the question to practitioners, is all the additional time and effort rewarded in the improvement of forecast performance versus a simpler method? And of course, Spiros Makridakis and Michel Hibon sought to answer the question in their paper, Accuracy of Forecasting and Empirical Investigation, which they published in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society in 1979. Most of you will know they found convincingly that simple methods at this point in their test outperformed more complex methods, including Box-Jenkins. And that's not only in relative effort terms, but in absolute terms. Now, the Royal Statistical Society, of which Gwilym Jenkins was still a member, was understandably, or not unexpectedly, less than impressed. Their response, with few exceptions, ranged from incredulity to outright condemnation, even accusing them of having flubbed the math. And for any of you who haven't read the commentaries or who aren't the subject of them, this is actually quite an entertaining read. It's quite interesting to see these RSS guys get so incensed at the idea that simple methods might actually work better. Ultimately, though, Spiros and Michel were certain of their findings and of the math, and to reinforce the results of their paper, the first M competition in 1982 was born. And it found, again, that in application, simple methods were outperforming more complex methods. Subsequent M's with increasingly complex data sets continued to find the same thing, although by M4, there were hints that machine learning was maturing to the point that the best practice may be changing. And of course, what's so exciting about the presentations we've just heard and of the M5 competition in its entirety is that this class of methods has now left us with no doubt that in correct application, they offer substantial value add. So the value and applicability of the M5 competition then is not only in its empirical demonstration of forecasting best practices in real world practice, but also now as a means for testing and refining emerging methods that will in the future become the best practice. Too often, forecasters are guilty of blindly aiming at perfection. And this is why shiny new ideas like big data 5 to 8 years ago, or blockchain for supply chain, or AI, with all due respect, capture so much attention. But business forecasters are not purveyors of forecast accuracy. Their job is to provide a tool for improving profitability, or put in more concrete terms, it's our job as practitioners to increase the profitability by increasing forecast accuracy to have an impact on tangible business metrics like profitability as a result of improved inventory turns or DOS, improved service OTIF to customers, or improved ROIC, return on invested capital, or cash conversion cycle. Without these impacts, the demand planning exercise might be intellectually delightful, but it's bad business. The M competitions are an important litmus test for business-focused practitioners to see demonstrably what works in real life. As a practitioner, first and foremost, I'm particularly interested today in understanding and mitigating the causes of bias in judgment, as forecasting, despite all its technological advances, remains a corporate function with human fingerprints all over its data, all over its process, and all over its outputs. The application of behavioral science then has become a core component of our approach to business forecasting, and it would be interesting to see in future iterations of the M's to see the impact of human action and judgment on the business processes that arise from the forecasts, however they're generated. Organizations, irrespective of size and technical sophistication, can immediately benefit from improvements in human decision-making, which is why we're so bullish on the practical impact of behavioral science to demand planning. Today, though, before I go too far off track, it's not about future M's, it's about the M5's applicability. So I'm now going to spend the next couple of moments introducing our next 4 speakers. Our first really requires no introduction, John Bowman from Walmart. We'll be speaking about the applicability of M5 to forecasting at Walmart. And for those of you who don't know, also supplied the sales data that you used in the competition. He's got decades of applied statistics and data science experience, including time at HP, Retail Solutions, and of course now Walmart Labs. He was a vice chair of TIMS, ORSA, the forerunner of Informs, for 4 years, and he currently leads the data science team responsible for developing and implementing forecasting algorithms for daily item sales at Walmart stores and e-commerce. Following John will be Madi Yousefi from Target. He's going to be looking at the M5 competition results, how they relate to the Target demand forecasting system they created, and drawing on some of the main conclusions of a recent publication, looking at a contrast between them and the lessons that they learned while working on their forecasting system along with their business partners. Madi is the lead AI scientist at Target, previously a data scientist at Walmart, and has done postdoc research at The Ohio State University and Texas A&M. Following Madi will be Tim Januszkowski from Amazon. Tim leads the time series analysis group at AWS AI Labs, focusing on forecasting, anomaly detection, and classification applications. Their algorithms power AWS AI services and are used in internal applications such as cloud capacity planning or labor planning. And they also have an open source forecasting library called GluonTS. Tim's also a director at the International Institute of Forecasters. He's going to be talking about research directions that will benefit from the M5 competition, and in particular, the data set used. He'll also be giving an overview of work done by his group in some of these areas, and looks forward to the future research that will be inspired by the M5 data set. And rounding out this group of practitioners looking at the applicability of M5 is Mike Gilliland, who will be looking at how, in general, organizations can benefit from the M5 findings. Mike is a board member of the IIF. He's the associate editor of Foresight, the Journal of Applied Forecasting, and also the author of several important publications which have practical application at their core, including the Business Forecasting Deal, and most recently as one of the editors of Business Forecasting. So we have a few moments left for any questions anyone may have, or if not, without further ado, I will turn it over to the speakers that you came here to hear from.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If there are any questions on the Q&A, otherwise we'll proceed with, no, there are no questions. Thank you again.